the biggest mistakes I see are people wake up and the first thing they do is drink coffee on an empty stomach. That generally is not great. The reason is because coffee on empty stomach has mechanisms that essentially are telling your stomach food is coming. It triggers certain processes with regards to enzymes, all these kind of things, but there's no food, right? So you're not processing. I've seen people that do that chronically have more anxiety, less content, worse sleep, generally overall sleep quality at night.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Charles Travers Show. Today I'm joined by Cliff. Cliff, welcome to the show.
Hey buddy, good to be here.
Good to see you. Today we're going to be deep diving into health, like how to improve your health, how to optimize it. I've worked actually with Cliff directly, and he is someone that has extensive experience within kind of optimizing and in looking at your health, autoimmune issues, a whole variety of different things. And obviously, Cliff, you've got your own health journey as well, in terms of your own kind of, history and battles with that. So I guess firstly, it would be good to start with one. I know that you've worked with, some really high level business owners and elite athletes. What led you to that point, like in terms of your story and where you started?
So what I will do, because I've probably told this a lot over the last 15 years, is I'll do this in like the 2x version, because otherwise we're going to be here forever, right? So basically, as soon as I was born, within 3 months, I started having issues. So I was born with a scoliosis and a kyphosis of my spine. So basically, to the left and to the back, right? So most people have nowadays, because of poor posture and things like this, you often would see things like a scoliosis or something, but mine was pretty severe. So I had 3 major operations by the age of 18 months. Which resulted essentially with the 3rd operation, meaning they had to puncture my lung, graft my floating rib, and basically fuse my thoracic spine, so my middle spine, basically. So I was very fortunate. I was at Great Ormond Street Hospital. I had a Dr. Webb at the time who was just renowned for this kind of stuff. And really, back then, we were talking like 40 years ago now, Jesus Christ, 40 years ago. And they were like, well, if we don't do this operation, he'll 100% be paralyzed. He'll be in a wheelchair for sure. And if we do it and it's successful, maybe, this will hold up. So, and I was fortunate. They did the operation. It held up. And I had to wear a brace around my whole body, plaster of Paris brace. So not like the lightweight ones that you can clip on and clip off nowadays, but a whole one as like a brace. And, obviously that caused me a lot of disturbance with bullying and all that kind of stuff at school, because who wouldn't notice that under your clothes if it looks like some shield of armor? So I was kind of being monitored all the way to 15. They fused it at 64 degrees, so I lost roughly about 6 inches of height because of it. And I was in a lot of pain all the way. I was always told, you can't lift heavy, you can't do contact sports, you can't do this, blah, blah, blah. Basically, you're fragile and weak. That's kind of what we was told. So then at 15, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease called ulcerative colitis, which is a horrendous disease for anyone that doesn't know. It involves you, losing a lot of blood, being on the toilet a lot. In the height of it, for me, when I was diagnosed, my blood count was half because I'd lost that amount of blood. Not totally doctor's fault, my fault, because I didn't tell anyone. But it got to the point where I was bleeding all the time. I was going to the toilet, can't control urges, had major ulceration all through my large intestine. And so at 15, then I was put on steroids, so prednisolone, basically, very standard, immune suppressant. And so I was on 40 milligrams, which was an adult dose as a kid. And every time they tried to wean me down off that, I just flare. again and again and again. So I'd get from 40 to 20, maybe 50 milligrams, because they were 5 milligram tablets. And then I'd just flare up again. And then after about a year, the conversation came of, well, maybe we need to remove your intestine, right? Which is sadly a common conversation in ulcerative colitis. But bear in mind at this time, no conversation on nutrition, no conversation on diet, no conversation on past medical history of how that might have affected my nervous system or any of these kind of things. The guy said brazenly, "Oh, you might want to avoid beer and oranges." That was basically it, right? And I was like, well, I'm 16 at this point. I'm like, I don't drink beer, and oranges, okay, fine, but nothing else. That was literally it, right? So that was that. And then I was on this steroid. And then at 16, getting towards 17, I started getting this double vision and 24/7 headache. And again, me being me, there's a lot of stories behind this. Me being me, I didn't tell anybody. I just kept squinting more, all this kind of stuff. Long story short, no one could avoid it in the end. Like, it was obvious that I was really struggling. So I had this like very specific double vision, had this constant headache. I was in sixth form at school in the UK, so I was 16, going 17 at that time. And I had an appointment. No, first of all, I went to the doctors and the doctor was like, okay, I'm going to send you for an eye test. Okay. They should have known from the type of double vision I told them that's not eyes, but something else. So long story short, sent me for an eye test, had an eye test. They were like, yeah, your eyes are perfect, but your optical nerve is super, super inflamed. So you've got a problem. You need to go to the hospital. As it turned out, I had an appointment that week anyway with my gastroenterologist for the ulcerative colitis for a checkup. And as soon as I walked in, he was a gastroenterologist, but he was also a pediatrician. And he looked at me and he was like, "Why are you squinting?" And then I was like, "Well, because I've got this, this, and this." Told him, and he was like, "Have you coughed up any blood?" Very specific questions, right? And then within half an hour, he had me in for a CT scan, of which they found a brain tumor, literally down the center of my brain. But it was on my short-term memory. And so I was very fortunate. I was in the catchment area of Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, and they had a guy who spent 3 to 4 months a year there, who lectures at Harvard and spends time in America, but comes over and does a certain stint within the NHS, a guy called Professor Pickard, and he basically did my operation. So they put a drain in to get rid of all of the issues, and because the tumor was so rare, they'd only seen it once before. It was a form of skin cancer in the brain, and it had just massively calcified. And they think I probably had it since I was born, but the steroids that I was on forced it to grow. So it stopped basically fluid being able to leave, so spinal fluid being able to leave. So long story short, they put a shunt in, drained the fluid, and they said, look, you can do your A levels, and then after your A levels, between when there and when you go to uni, we can take it out. So long story short, had it out in July. I think it was 1st July I went in, and they took it out, and they discharged me on the 7th. So I was literally done. I've got this beautiful S-shaped scar all the way from here, all the way to the back of my head, and no skull here, so it freaks people out a little bit, right? And long story short, when they were taking the staples out, there was some leakage at the top of my head. So they obviously stitched it up right and sent me home. But what they didn't do was stitch the right area. So I went home. I woke up in the middle of the night and I had the same headache that essentially I had before all the operation, everything. And there was literally fluid all over my pillow, basically. So my mum drove me to the hospital. They did all my stats and everything. They were like, no, okay, you're okay. Temperature's a little up, but, go home. And then they stitched it up again. And then when I woke up in the morning, it was still leaking, but just less. And then I was worse probably than before. So symptoms, fatigue, all this kind of stuff. So my mum, being my mum, obviously had spent many years of me being sick. So I've been through this enough. Basically took me to the hospital, stormed me onto the ward and demanded to see the professor that I had. And they took some blood, and within 3 hours, I was diagnosed with like meningitis of the brain, basically. because of the infection. And the next 4 weeks of my life, yeah, I don't even remember. So I was on crazy drugs and all sorts of stuff. So that was like the major stuff up until about 17, getting to 18. Um, and yeah, like at that point, I didn't know anything about health, didn't care. I was at that point, went to university. They changed my drug. I was on azathioprine, which is a horrible drug for things like your liver, your spleen, and all these kind of things. But at that time, I was oblivious. I was symptom free. So I was drinking. I was doing all sorts of stuff, right? Just living a university life. But because I wasn't getting this acute, horrible need to go to the toilet 20 times a day or bleeding or whatever it might be, I'm like, everything's fine, right? So that was it. And then I would go through these horrible, like, rebound weight gain issues. So, like, at one point at uni, I was like 77 kilos. And bear in mind, at the moment, I'm 58. Right. So, and that's my kind of like fighting weight, so to speak, where I'm lean and in good shape and all this kind of stuff. So, like 77 kilos on a guy who's 5 foot is pretty much like a beach ball. Right. So, metabolically, I was messing myself up and that was really it. And I didn't really think anything of it until late 2008 when the whole crash came and, a set of circumstances happened where I was able to leave the finance job I was in, and for whatever reason, it just came to me. I was like, you know what, I need to look after myself. And ended up going to London to start as a personal trainer in 2008.
Wow. It's a hell of a crazy story, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it's someone like myself that has from an early age looking back, had some issues. It does make you realize there's always someone that's had to battle things at. There's always someone that, had to deal with things that were a lot worse. And, in your case, it's incredible that your level of resilience to go through that thing at such a young age as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like from a mental perspective, how did you deal with that? Was that something that you were conscious of, like having to go through all of these things, or was it only until a little bit later on in life where you had to kind of do the necessary, maybe inner work to resolve some of that, almost trauma in some level? When you're ill, you don't realize the level of pain you go through until you're out the other side.
Yeah.
How did you kind of cope with the mental side of constantly having to deal with physical health issues?
I would always say to people, hindsight is 20/20. Right. So you can look back and be like, oh, I did this, this, and this because that, and that. Right. But in the moment, that isn't really the conscious choice, if that makes sense. So I think obviously from 0 to 2, I didn't know a huge amount about it, right? It was just life happening to me. Very possible, right? As in that was it. And I think the thing is with it, them 2 years really shaped me in a way that I could never really comprehend, right? Because the way I describe it to people is the hardest thing that's ever happened to you is the hardest thing you've ever had happen. And people don't really get that. But we live in arguably the safest time that's ever existed, right? So the hardest thing that's ever happened to certain people is, without being horrible, not that hard for most people. Like, obviously there's horrible abuse and there's wars in certain areas of the world and all these kind of things, right? But if we go at a population Western level, if the hardest thing that's happened to you is, I don't know, someone calls you a name in a playground or whatever it might be, the difference in how I think people build resilience or go through their journey is what changes them, right? And what you can deal with. There's a certain genetic element to this as well, where we could talk about certain genes and how people process stress, for instance, compared to other people. We could talk about COMT and MAOA and BHMT and stuff. But the reality is that I feel at the time, to answer your question, there wasn't a conscious thing of me saying, oh, okay, especially during the colitis up until 16 and the tumor and all those kind of things. I'll tell you a very specific story about that. But obviously when I was so young, not really much memory of that stuff. And then the colitis stuff, I remember going through it all, but it was very still happening to me. Like, what, I wasn't a victim in the fact of, oh, woe is me. Like, I never really thought that way, but I was like, well, this is shit, if that makes sense. Like, that was how it was. The tumor was a bit different because I remember when I had the CT scan, they told us specifically, I'll have the CT scan, go home, and then we'll call you to come back in results and all this stuff. And so when they did the CT scan, I looked at the woman who was doing the scan and she got on the phone pretty much straight away. And I was like, when I came out, I said to my mum, I was like, they found something for sure. And she was like, no, you won't know that. You won't know that. Because they asked me to go outside and sit outside. Right. And I was like, okay, this is not the playbook. Right. So what I remember from that was us going up to the office, and behind the doctor, there was two images there. And you could see like this marble kind of size, medium marble kind of thing down the center of my brain. And he was like, oh, I'm sorry to inform you. It looks like you have a brain tumor, blah, blah, blah. And in that moment, like, there was no other thoughts in my mind other than, I can't believe my parents have to go through this again. Right. And so some would say that's selfless or whatever it might be. But I think that was really much of, as hindsight, it was much of a function of a frozen stroke, functional freeze nervous system response, if that makes sense. So it very much of, I was used to getting through tough things, right? And then it was just like, now I have to help these people around me, because I had a girlfriend at the time that I'd been seeing quite a while, and obviously my parents and stuff. And it was almost like I just turned into, how can I look after these people, if that makes sense. So there wasn't any work. I wasn't, like Marta, my wife, who's a genius of, hypnotherapy, trauma, somatics, nervous system regulation, all this stuff. She's been journaling since she was like 11, right? I didn't know what journal was until probably I met her. Does that make sense? So like 15 years ago or something along the, and still then when she told me, I'm like, yeah, that's not for me. So the thing is with it is that I can't, I couldn't sit here and pretend, oh yeah, I had, parents that were, open to all this kind of stuff or any of these kind of things. They were very practical, especially my mum, and very practical in like, this is what it is. We get through this, like we take the next step, and it kind of how it is, if that makes sense. So I didn't necessarily have the skills, I wouldn't say, to deal with it. I think it was just kind of certain learned traits. One thing I would say is I had unbelievable support, right? That I think probably made the biggest difference.
Interesting. So you said that you left your financial job 2008. Yeah. And then you went to become a personal trainer, which I didn't know. Okay. Yeah. And then from that, that's where
I met Marta.
That's where you met your wife, Marta. Okay. So those listed in, Cliff and Marta, they're married and they work together. Cliff's you're more on the, physical, metabolic side of things, and Marta's really good at the kind of nervous system side of, so that you guys complement each other really well. So personal trainer, and then how did that personal trainer evolve into the Cliff we know today, who's helping business owners with their health and elite athletes? Like, how did that transformation happen?
I feel, first of all, it was selfish, right? It was definitely selfish. I am not, certain people talk about, these grandiose plans of want to change the world and all these kind of things. Like, I was not in good shape. I hated my body. I didn't like how I looked at myself. All of these kind of things. I was massively insecure. Lots of stories there. And I really, I wanted to feel better. I didn't know why. I hadn't done any deep dive on why. I just knew that how I felt. I was emotional eating, for instance. Like, I'd get home from work and I just, now, God knows how many sweets, for instance, because I had the house, I had the car, blah, 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 but I lived alone, if that makes sense. It just, incredible insecurities in patterns. So I just knew I wanted to feel better. So I got this payoff, which was enough to kind of pay for the course and a few months down in London where I was. And I was like, I want to do something to feel better. And I didn't know any more than that. There was no plan. There was no business plan. There was no, I'm going to be the best personal trainer or anything like this, right? But very quickly, we were quite fortunate back then. Free speech was still a thing. And we had a couple of mentors within the personal training that had very well researched views on nutrition. And that got my attention because I was like, all the stuff I'd been doing, there wasn't any real relief in it. I was still on the drugs, azathioprine, these kind of things, right? And I know it was affecting bone density because I'd have to have these scans and all these checks, all that kind of stuff. And they started speaking some stuff, and I just started playing around with it. And nothing was drastic to start with. It was like, drink less alcohol, right? Don't be an idiot. Stop drinking 5 days a week. And then, prioritize sleep, look at these things, look at these things. And that is really what kind of spiked it for me, and also Marta, because Marta was struggling with like real chronic fatigue issue stuff from corporate stuff that she left at the same time. And that was really the start of it. And I'm one of these people, I guess, that I have this annoying tendency to go, why? Why does that work? Because that was it. Like initially I went into nutritional therapy, and there's obviously a highly holistic side to that. And I then went into looking into naturopathy, functional medicine, all of these areas. And I was like, well, these things are all great, but I kept getting these people that I was helping, and things that should work for them wasn't. That's annoying to me. Like, that really annoys me. When apparently you've learned this perfect model, right? And you're like, yeah, if you help someone's gut, this is just going to fix them, right? You help them do this, thyroid or whatever it might be, right? The functional model. I just kept seeing these people. I was like, yeah, it's good. And they get a little bit better when you put them on this strict elimination, right? Because, well, who wouldn't? You're basically taking everything out of their diet, right? You'll get the odd person that won't work for, but for most people, if they just took all the junk out of their diet, all the allergens, all them things for 30 days, they'll probably feel a little bit better. The thing is with it won't fix anything, right? The absence of allergens is not fixing the pathway that is compromised by them issues, right? So then I started thinking, okay, well, I need to look at this at a different level. So I started studying biochemistry, started studying immunology, neurobiology, neuroimmunology, like in my private time as I was working with people. And all of a sudden, I just started seeing where a lot of this stuff falls down. And that was because I started solving problems for people that were a higher level complexity, like a lot of chronic issues. People started getting referred to me for autoimmune, for instance, because I got myself off my meds quite quickly. And I've been off them. This year will be 16 years in June. And there's not an accident to that. You don't get lucky to do that, if that makes sense. And so I started looking at that and reversing out the things that I did that potentially could be main triggers, if that makes sense. So it was just, I'm just a geek is really the honest answer. And I'm still at this point, still not happy with models and protocols. Like whenever I hear someone tell me I'm on this protocol, I'm like, okay, it's probably bullshit for 8 out of 10 people. Because a protocol is a standard way to give someone something without looking at the person at a deep level, right? It should work for you, right? So that for me causes a clash in how I think. And so as a side effect to that, we started getting referred to other people. Had one very, very successful entrepreneur in 2015 that I met in New York who told a story on stage about having some 5 years good quality life to live because he was diagnosed with a progressive neurological autoimmune issue. And when he come off stage, he didn't know me from Adam. I just grabbed him and I said, look, no offense, that story's bullshit. And he looked at me as if to say, like, who the hell are you? And I said, look, let me take you to lunch. I'm going to explain what I think this is. If it's bullshit, forget me. You can tell everyone it's rubbish. And then long story short, I got him symptom med free in about 6 months. And now this guy is probably, let's say, one of the most well-known entrepreneurs on the planet. Sold several companies now, doing amazingly well, very happy, family, children, all these kind of things. And that obviously gets people's attention. right? But then as a side effect to that, I helped a guy who had his own gut issues, but he was working for a pro cycling team as like a chef, right? So you don't know how you get these kind of referrals initially, but I was working with him, did a good job with him, and he was like, oh, one of our pro cyclists is having this like decline, he's having these gut issues, these kind of things, could you help him out? Yeah, long story short, we that guy became a client for like 8 years, and which is crazy in professional sport because they have team doctors, team nutritionists, they have everything, right? But yet no one could solve his issue, and yeah, that guy just won the time trial in Australia just a few weeks ago, and he was back to back time trial champion since we worked with him. And when he first came to us, he was losing, I think, for the last 2 years, he'd lost 2.5% on his performance each year, so compounding. So he was really worried. And obviously, these guys often only get 2-3 year contracts. So the worry is obviously if you don't have a contract, you don't get paid, you don't have a team, right? So yeah, we were fortunate, when we don't really have fancy marketing or any of these kind of things. It's just that the results, I guess, put us in front of people.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess from that, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, why is it that some people can on paper have like the cleanest diet, the perfect protocol, and they're still dealing with chronic symptoms and issues, whereas there'll be another person who on paper has a terrible diet, awful, can eat what they want, can drink what they want, maybe even smokes, and doesn't appear on the surface to have any health issues. Could you kind of explain that for the people that are watching and listening in? Because I know you've talked a lot about threshold levels and how some people have issues with that, and it'd be great to kind of dissect that, because I think I've been there before where I'm feeling like I'm doing everything that I can to get better and I'm just not getting better. So yeah, it would be it'd be good for you to kind of explain that in a little bit more detail based on your experience.
Yeah, so this was something that's probably taken me about 15 years to get really clear on. And so I'll break it down into 2 sections. The first section is what we call the resilience spectrum. Okay. So the resilience spectrum, you have the most. I have like a questionnaire from this. Anyone wants it, just reach out to me. I'll send it to them. It's free. So basically, you have this resilient spectrum. So let's say on the left-hand side, you have the most resilient people, right? These are your what we would call centurions. They're the people you see on the news, if you watch the news still, the 30 people that do. So basically, they're the people you see on the news, and they are, 100 or just on their 100th birthday or something, they're having a cigarette. They're like, yeah, I drink, I attribute living long to 2 whiskeys a day or whatever it might be, right? These are your centurions. They probably have a lower stress lifestyle. That's probably something that you could probably correlate to these kind of things. But these people could probably do whatever they want and still get to at least 80. Do you see what I mean? So these are your super resilient. On the other end of the spectrum, you could probably argue after hearing my story, I'm probably closer to that. Right, so that other end of the spectrum is dead, right? Literally, the least resilient you could be is dead. So as someone who was diagnosed with chronic disease, with, brain tumor, with all these kind of things, with spinal issues, I'm much less resilient. Okay, so the way I describe it to people is your first job is to identify, honestly, where you are on that spectrum. Because most people are trying to live like the centurion. But their history, their symptoms, the illnesses they're diagnosed with actually put them way over the 50% marker towards this level of risk, if that makes sense. So the first thing is we have to be honest about where we are on that resilience spectrum. Okay. And we can do that by doing screening, right? We can do a resilience form to see how resilient you are in different physiological, psychological, emotional areas, for instance. We can look at family history. If you've got a strong family history of autoimmune, for instance, or celiac disease, or, maybe some genetic predispositions for hyperlipidemia, for instance, these are things that are definitely going to make you, so you should be way more aware, right? The one I'm not as concerned about when people say to me, oh, I have a family history of heart disease, or I have a family history of diabetes, I'm like, they're man-made diseases, right? The reality is, to give you an idea of how man-made these are, So they took at Yale University, they took a group of students, no pre-diabetes, no diabetes, and they did CT angiograms of their arteries, right? So these are 20-year-old kids, healthy, not obese, not overweight, okay? They already found up to 28% narrowing of their arteries, major arteries, okay? What I want people to understand is something like cardiovascular disease is a decades journey to that heart attack on the treadmill or the thing, right? They're like, oh, that person was healthy. You know, they hardly drunk, they hardly smoked, but they had a heart attack. Oh, so unlucky. It's like, no, it's not. It's not unlucky. It's very unlikely. It's unlucky, if that makes sense. So when we get into those, there's a little bit of nuance, but that resilience spectrum is the first thing that I really want to look at with people to understand where they are. The second thing is what I kind of call my secret sauce, right? And there's no secret because I'm going to tell you all, but I call it the secret sauce because yeah, this is what it is. So essentially, we have these three categories. So we have these people that we see that are either immune dysregulated, so they've got allergies, they've got autoimmune, they're reactive to their environments, right? And they also have, maybe together or separately, nervous system disorders. So these people are much more prone to low mood, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, right? Withdrawing from society, these kind of things, right? So you have this side. So this side of it, we would call hypersensitization of the system. Okay, so they've lost tolerance of their system or things are affected their system. On the other side of it, we have these people that are not predisposed to those issues, the same as these people, but they are suffering of what we would call a burden. Okay, so without getting into cell biochemistry, every single one of your cells, they communicate to other cells, and then that affects systems and organs and all this kind of stuff, right? So what happens is we live in a world where we're exposed to a lot of different things, right? Whether it's mold in the home that no one thinks much of because they just think mold is like growing all over the wall, right? They don't think it's in their HVAC system, or they don't think it's, you know, the iceberg effect of you see a tiny bit of mold on the sealer of your shower, for instance, but they don't realize behind that shower is wood, right? And it's probably feeding off that, and that's why the constant moisture is seeing it grow there, for instance. So we have these environmental issues. So whether it's chemicals, whether it's stuff in the sky, whether it is, you know, the cleaning chemicals we use at home, whether it's the companies that make all these things, their argument is, well, the percentage that's in this product is not enough to hurt someone. Okay. The argument with that is it kind of is a bit like a bell-shaped curve. There is good evidence to show that tiny amounts of many things together can actually cause as much, if not more damage than a single high exposure of one product. Okay, so there's good evidence that I'm a geek. So if anyone wants any of these studies or anything like this, I am jam-packed with them. Pretty much every one of my browsers is all studies. So the thing is with it, is what we have to understand is that there are certain people that build up an amount of burden. We haven't even talked about, obviously, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, all this kind of stuff in foods. They pick up this amount of burden that your body should be able to clear this stuff normally, right? Whether you inhale it and you've got immune cells in your nostrils, you've got immune cells on your tonsils, right? You have immune cells on your tongue, right? So we have all these protection mechanisms to be able to help us. And so as systems start to get beaten up and weighed down as we age, we associate it to aging, right? It's not really, it probably is more likely to do with age, but exposure, and you've got more burden. So what starts to happen is the cell, essentially, a single cell has, you know, pumps, it has receptors, it has all sorts of things. And within the cell, you have the little batteries like the mitochondria to produce energy, right? You have the nucleus that's going to help produce proteins to fold different proteins into different functions in the body, whether it's hormones or, you know, different things for regenerate muscle, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. So what happens, we see, is that the matrices around the cells start to dysfunction. So the way that things get in and out of the cell changes. Okay, well, if that happens, you're then going to start affecting how the cell functions. So how it produces energy, for instance. Well, if you affect how that cell produces energy, what's going to happen? Well, then mitochondria, you need lots of them in your brain, right? So when people think of brain fog, right, they're like, well, why am I not thinking straight? Right. Well, that could be the synapses not firing its energy within themselves, right? So that burden, for instance, could be from environmental toxins. That's absolutely possible. I see that a lot. The other thing the burden can be is like from insulin resistance,
Mm.
right? So people have poor blood glucose management, for instance. It could also come from, terrible sleep. All of these things that just suppress systems. A lot of people will then go, well, I'm going to do fasting or I'm going to do liver cleanses or any of these things. But these are all adding stuff in. Does that make sense? Like my approach with it from a physiological point of view is like, what can we subtract? What are the things that we see are putting the most burden on you and sensitization on you that we can remove to give you some threshold back, right? That's what kind of brings it onto threshold. And so once you can start understanding, actually, this is more of a subtraction game rather than insert, IV glutathione or stem cells or and peptides. And I'm not to say them things don't work, but the amount of people that have come to me that have spent 30 grand on stem cells or, all this on IVs or 100 grand here or 50 grand there, and they're still stuck 3, 4 months later, right? They're like, yeah, it worked why I did it. It's a bit like when people say, I did this diet and it worked why I did it, but as soon as I stopped, I'm like, well, that's not really working, right? That's that mindset needs to shift. So that's kind of how I look at it, if that makes sense, of how I separate a person, how I understand where their resilience is, and then what we can then do in order to start saying to this person, okay, well, this is a game of subtraction. And so the subtraction would be, okay, going top level down. So most people, if you think of it like a pyramid, right, everyone's trying to optimize the tip of the pyramid. It's like, what, expensive supplement do I need? Or what crazy training protocol do I need? Or what crazy restriction in lifestyle do I need? Right. But it's kind of like a house of cards, right? People are not building a strong base. So they can do this really extreme thing like 75 hard or some ridiculous thing in my mind. And what it teaches them in their mind, really, if you think about it, is that I have to do this crazy hard thing to see any improvement. Well, is that a pattern you can continue? Right? Can you constantly do something harder without taking away from your capacity or threshold over here? But the problem we have so much nowadays is that, oh, this thing will fix it because that's how we're sold.
Yeah. Yeah. It's everyone wants quick, instant results. And yeah, I think, I'm sure, as health doesn't work like that. It especially if you don't know potentially what the triggers are, the root cause of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you build, like, I guess, you talked about resistant levels and how some people are more, resilient than others. Then you talked about extraction. It's more of an extraction game to start with. When you're working with clients, what's kind of the first steps that you take for someone that's, dealing with potentially autoimmune issues, have got chronic symptoms that they've had for years? What's the first steps in that process to start to, I guess, give them some relief, or at least get them started in the right direction, I think, more importantly?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose there's a couple of levels to this. It depends on obviously if they're a client or if it's someone listening. So let's do it for someone listening, because if you do it as a client, I'm going to test them, right? And I'm going to use world-class labs like Cyrex or Immunosciences that I have no affiliation to, but, trust them to the nth degree to look at this kind of stuff. And so outside of that, let's say you have someone with nervous system disorders and you have someone with autoimmune disorders, right? What people don't understand is we spend a lot of time doing nervous system regulation stuff, if you're aware and you're watching this kind of stuff, right? So maybe you've done trauma work, maybe you've done, somatics, healing, even plant ceremonies like I've done, and all these kind of things over the years, which have transformed my inner self, right? And how I see myself. Yet what I found for me personally, because of my own biology, was that it never really clicked. And that was frustrating because then it was just like, well, I need the new mentor. I need the new, there must be another subconscious story or there must be another thing, right? And that really wasn't the most true thing for me. What I started to discover was for these type of people, there are interactions with the nervous system and the brain which are physiological, which makes it tricky because no one talks about this stuff. So
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. There are about 20 to 25% of the world that carry a certain set of genetics that make them hyper responsive to mold. Okay, so these HLA-DR genes, and essentially, when you inhale them, you have two routes. So you can inhale these mold spores, and we're really talking about Aspergillus, Penicillium, Stachybotrys, black mold, for instance. There's lots and lots within them, different species and everything, but they're the three main categories that we know drive a lot of immunological issues. So, for instance, when you inhale them, you have a different route. So when you inhale, if you have immune dysregulation, these IgG cells not going to function as they should. So what happens is these mold spores, when you inhale them, they will interact with the olfactory nerves. So people have probably heard about the olfactory nerves because of COVID, right? Because of smell and taste. So them olfactory nerves, although they're not essentially on the inside of your brain, they communicate directly to your brain, right? So these 20-25% of people, when that happens, this could cause a neurological inflammation response from like brain fog, anxiety on the spot, like nervousness, these kind of things, without even knowing, right, that that's the trigger for them. Then you can also inhale them, right? They could be via your food. There's lots of foods that we'd think that are processed and stored well, but if you have a diet, this is not saying I'm a carnivore fan, because this is what people are going to say, but if you have a diet that's high in grains, poor quality, coffee, things that are stored, right, and should be stored properly, but they're normally not. They're normally in humid environments or outside. It gets wet. Mold will grow within 24 hours, right, on certain things. So it doesn't take long. So when you can inhale them, but you could also ingest them via food, right? And as they make their way into your digestive system, that, for instance, their mold spores can change the way that the microbiome or the gut essentially expresses itself. That can cause all sorts of issues with regards to hormone issues for women, with regards to, hormone issues for men, and I can get into that a little bit deeper. So that's one thing. But that's people are like, yeah, but that's only 20 to 25% of humans, right? I think it's conservative. But
That's a lot still, though, isn't it? That's a
yeah,
hell of a lot.
but the next bit is arguably worse. Certain molds produce what we call mycotoxins, okay, as a byproduct. So basically, when you have lots of molds within an environment, to avoid too much competition, they produce this waste product, which is like a mycotoxin. Okay. There was a study done in 2006, and they showed that 100% of people that were exposed to mycotoxins had negative nervous system responses. So
Yeah.
the good news is not everyone of molds produce mycotoxins. There's millions, thousands of types of mold. But there are subsets of mold, maybe 30, 35 of them that are well known to do it, if that makes sense. And so the thing is with it is that environmentally, to answer your question, we kind of like go top down. How safe is your home? Because nowadays we're spending 90% of our day indoors, right? Most places don't have good ventilation. On the last government survey in the US, and I use the US because that's kind of like the biggest Western experiment so far. So in the US, they had 54% of homes in the US have current water damage. Right, and bear in mind it takes 24 hours for mold to grow, right? Then they looked at not just current water damage that you could see, but who would report a leak previously. That took that number up to near 78%. Right? So now we're facing a place, and we go to places like New Zealand, even worse, right? Or high humid areas like a Cyprus or Malta, these kind of places. Beautiful places. I know, lived in Cyprus 6 years, but horrendous if you are sensitized to mold. So the thing is with it is that mold is an issue for sure, right? We won't get into endotoxins and all that kind of stuff, but these things all play a role. So I really want to understand people's environment first, right? Because if, for instance, you do the crazy diet, of course, you're taking allergens out and you're taking things that might interact. So you probably feel a little bit better. But as soon as you start to add things back in, and these are the people with the chronic gut issues and all these kind of things, you'll get flare ups quite quickly. And then the next time you go as extreme, you get less progress and less progress and less progress, right? And that's the frustrating bit for people. So I would say the environment is probably going to be really important for people to understand, right? Understanding their sleep. I want everyone to fix their circadian rhythm. We could talk about what that is, for instance.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, it'd be good, yeah, to those listening, because actually, when I'd heard of it before we started working together, but I never really understood what it meant.
Yeah.
I just thought, okay, it was maybe get to sleep at a certain time and wake up at a certain time, but I didn't really understand the mechanisms of it. So if you could go and explain a little bit about that, that would be amazing.
Yeah. So circadian rhythm is probably the most inconvenient but highest yielding change I can make in most people, right? Because my argument is adhering to a good circadian rhythm means you have to be an adult. That's basically it. People won't like me when I say this. But the reality is that circadian rhythm, and there's all circadian rhythms and blah, 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 but circadian rhythm essentially is the programming of every single cell in your body, right? And we can simply influence that by the light we're exposed to or not exposed to at what times of the day, whether we are eating or not eating, right? So food or fasting, and then also movement, right? So when we move and don't move. So I've had people that have had chronic issues, and I have a lady at the moment in Canada I've done this with, chronic gut issues. And all we did with her was fix her circadian rhythm. And she is now sleeping through the night. She has more energy in the morning. She falls to sleep naturally at night, doesn't wake up 5 times a night. We haven't put her on a restricted diet. We haven't put her on any crazy supplements. We haven't run any testing yet. Like, that's literally it for now. And people are like, well, I've tried all this. And I'm like, there's hearing it, there's knowing it, and then there's really doing it, right? That's really it. So when we talk about this, the way I would set this up very simply for someone is obviously it's going to be slightly different depending on the seasons, where you are, light, all the excuses come up. So essentially, when I get someone, I ideally want them to wake up within an hour of sunrise, right? And so in the winter, that's going to be a little bit different. I wake up at the moment before sunrise, right? So my rhythm, if I go to bed at 9:30, my rhythm will wake me up somewhere about 6-ish, something like this, before sunrise. What I have is a lamp that essentially produces what we call 10,000 lux, right? Which is a measurement of light, which will signal to my body I'm awake, if that makes sense. Okay. And so that's how I personally do it. Then I mix in movement. And then after that, after an hour or two, I have food, right? So I generally, for the first hour, the biggest mistakes I see are people wake up and the first thing they do is drink coffee on an empty stomach. That generally is not great. The reason is because coffee on empty stomach has mechanisms that essentially are telling your stomach food is coming. It triggers certain processes with regards to enzymes, all these kind of things, but there's no food, right? So you're not processing. I've seen people that do that chronically have more anxiety, less content, worse sleep, generally overall, sleep quality at night. So generally I would get people to, and it's not to say, if anyone follows me, they'll know how obsessed I am with good quality coffee. So it's not to say coffee is bad. But my point is, if I can get someone up within around an hour of sunrise, and the first thing they do is get as much light as possible for 5 to 20 minutes, right? That will trigger at a cell level nearly every single cellular process, from hormonal regulation to neurotransmitters to all these different things, right? Because the biggest problem so many people have is when they wake up, they feel like they're dragged through a bush backwards, right? They're just like this. And the reason that's happening is because where you haven't gone through the right architecture of sleep cycles, which are 90-minute sleep cycles, essentially, if you go to bed too late, you're going to miss out on a lot of deep sleep, for instance. And if you then have less deep sleep, you're going to have less physical recovery. You're going to then have altered levels of REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement, which is associated to your nervous system, all these kind of things, emotional stuff. So you're just kind of kicking the can down the road, but you're losing like important stuff. You don't know this on day one, right? But years, weeks, months, years, right? People I deal with, high responsibility, hard to switch off, all these kind of things are constantly thinking, right? So thinking's important. If you've got to make £1 billion decisions, you can't wake up having to drag your ass out a bit, right? It doesn't make any sense. So first thing is to get light exposure. If they could combine that with a walk, perfect, right? Even better for me, 20 minutes. Doesn't have to be hard, doesn't have to be crazy. And then from there is I try and get them to have nothing but water in the first hour of their day, maybe 90 minutes, if their blood glucose is good. And then from there, the average person will tell you that they eat 3 to 5 times a day. All right. When you actually look at what people do, it's closer to 15 times a day. Because how many times do people just like, oh, I'm just going to have a couple of nuts, or I'm just going to have a biscuit, or I'm just going to have this, I'm just going to have this, right? And like we said, food is a potent programmer of rhythms. And so I try and get people, if they've got really stable rhythms, to have 3 solid meals a day. Some people, I change that to 2 bigger meals. Some people, if their blood glucose, if you're someone who really struggles in between meals with anxiety, mood issues, these kind of things, you probably need more meal frequency to start with, while you're dealing with the underlying mechanisms from the brain, the liver, the pancreas, of why you can't maintain blood glucose levels, if that makes sense. So I try and pigeonhole the first part of the day, and then the last part of the day, as soon as sun goes down, I do my best to have low lighting, for instance, no lights above my head, try and keep it more like lamps at that kind of height, generally more orangey kind of lights. I generally use, blue blockers last 90 minutes before bed, because I find if they're used too early, and this is where all the biohackers go wrong, like where they're using it throughout the day, if you use it often too early before bed, you'll start changing your rhythm too much and you'll start waking up really, really early, like 4 or 5 a.m. constantly. So like, for instance, for some people, 2-3 hours is better for them. Other people's around 90 minutes, 60 minutes to 90 minutes. And I do my best to try and get people, like my phone, for instance, I have a application that blocks it from 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. And then from, I think it's about 5:45 in the evening, all the way until the next day. So no social media, no emails, no nothing, right? Doesn't mean I'm not going to sit and watch something with Marta, for instance, on Netflix or whatever it might be, up until around 7 p.m. But after that, I know if I want the best sleep, and bear in mind, as someone with a 64 degrees scoliosis, kyphosis of their spine, sleep has been the bane of my life for my whole life. But, things like HRV, heart rate variability, which is associated to cardiovascular risk, nervous system. When I started fixing my circadian rhythm on its own, my HRV would go from 30s to now my average is somewhere in the 80s. For instance, my restorative sleep goes from anywhere from previously, like 2008-9, when I first started measuring it, was maybe an hour and 15. And now I'm closer to 4 hours, 4.5 hours of restorative sleep. And so roughly about 35 to 50% of your sleep, total sleep, should be restorative. You're always going to have long, light sleep because that's part of these cycles, if that makes sense. So the architecture rather than the time is important.
Interesting. Yeah, it's something that you've told me before, and it's easy to think about doing. It's hard to actually consistently do, especially when you've been in this you've been in these bad habits for so long. And it can be easy just let me just watch this, or let me just check my phone. And yeah, I'm certainly guilty of it, and I know many people are, constantly looking at your phone, regardless of what time it is. So, these things are important, like you said. That it's getting the foundations right, as you mentioned. And
they're just not sexy. Do you see what I mean? And they're not. And this is why, because we can get. I work with a lot of people with ADHD, autism, all of these kind of spectrum disorders from neurological side, and there isn't no one you can't improve if you change their exposure. Like I've not had one person in probably the last 10 years working with these kind of people that you couldn't improve if you change their exposure. And I'm talking severe autism. We're not talking people that are just self-diagnosing on the internet or something. I'm talking about children diagnosed at 5, non-verbal, severe. So if you can improve these people, the rest of it becomes excuses for us as humans for the most stake. And I don't mean to say that in a horrible way, but I had to call myself out on this stuff, because it's very easy to be like, oh no, my problem is unique, or my problem is, different. And yeah, there'll always be nuances, and I would never negate that for anyone. But what is it? I think it's like Marcus Aurelius, and a Stoic, who was like, what, the obstacle is the way. Right, so it's like the thing that is probably the most challenging for you is probably the thing that you probably need to address, right? If that makes sense. So yeah, I'm just a fan of self-responsibility, and the reality is to it, entrepreneurs, athletes, they're wired in a way they want to solve problems, but the fear of these people is that they're so excellent in this area, they're scared to address this one because they feel like the amateur, and they've not felt like that for a long period of time. And obviously, when you're super successful, whether it's monetary wise, business wise, sport wise, that comes with an ego, right? And that's all of us. For me, I would say I'm probably knowledgeable in these areas, right? But yet when I go to other areas like Marta's Polish and I try and learn Polish, I feel like a complete idiot. Do you see what I mean? But you have to, in my mind, you have to learn to be humble in order to really change and to learn, if that makes sense. And that was the biggest challenge for me, was actually really understanding how so many of these people, it just boggled my mind. I'm like, you're just so elite in these areas. Like, why is this so hard for you? And then when obviously Marta would do work with them and we'd have discussions and stuff, it was so much of it was a threat of not being seen as this person anymore, right? Because they just feel so incompetent, not in a disrespectful way, but they personally feel incompetent within them areas.
Yeah, I think also it's very. I remember for a long time it's difficult to switch off when you're that kind of A-type personality.
Yep.
And I would, the higher level you are and the higher achiever you are in business or as an athlete, the harder it is going to be able to switch off and focus on these things that are related to your health, not the main accolade that you're trying to go after in your business or in your sport. So it's a difficult one, because you're kind of wired. You've been wired one way for so long, to be able to try and effectively switch that off at times, I would imagine is challenging.
My counter to that with people is that they are wired in a certain way to solve problems, but because they've been so switched on and just running their dopamine system into the ground for so long, they've actually lost capacity, as in total capacity, to do anything else. So actually it's a threshold issue. Does that make sense? Let me give you a real life example of this. The hustlers won't love me for this conversation, but think about neurotransmitters for a minute, right? And not everyone's going to be a master of neurotransmitters, but I'll make it as simple as possible. So if you want to move towards something, right, you're going to require dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline to activate pathways for you to focus and move towards a reward. We know that, right? But what people don't realize is that when you have dopamine, it recycles via serotonin. Right? So serotonin is another neurotransmitter. It's a stress-based neurotransmitter, but it's also the one that helps you feel content. right? So you could lay your head on the pillow at night, could be a super hard day, but you're like, yeah, you know what? Everything's okay. I don't know many people that feel like that, right? Especially high achievers. So what happens is when you drive this dopamine system, yes, you're moving towards something. But what you do as a side effect is you suppress serotonin. So what do you do when you suppress serotonin? You suppress creativity and you suppress openness. So what I say to these people is, are you sure you want to be driving towards that thing? Because just driving towards something doesn't mean it's necessarily the right thing, right? Maybe it's just something we were sold, or what, oh, your business is not doing great, just work harder. Yeah, okay, I understand that. There are some people that could work harder, but do they have the right model? Do they love what they do? Are they sure this is the thing they want to be doing for the next X amount of years? Or, do they want to be approaching their career this way? They want to be in that business or whatever it might be, right? These are conversations that people are not having because they don't have capacity. Right. So sometimes the job is to reorient them to allow to have that nice balance between serotonin, dopamine. We can get into GABA and all the other inhibitory ones, but them two are really mistaken. And that causes a lot of issues with people, for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. So we talked about environment. Your environment's key. Circadian rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch on diet because
All right.
This is one area, and I'm talking from personal experience. I've tried many diets under the book. And if you open your Instagram, there's one person saying, carnivore's the best thing ever. And there's another one saying, no, you got to be a raw vegan and this is bad or this is good. And there's so much different information that to the average person, it's difficult to digest on where you should be focusing. So I guess from your personal experience or from your viewpoint, what would you suggest is, a good diet for the majority of people to kind of follow? And do you have any certain things that you want to look at first before you're suggesting a particular diet based on their situation?
Yeah. Diet is a hell of an industry, right? I'll echo what Peter Attia says about this. Dietary science is the most flawed science we ever produce all the time. The way we conduct studies around dietary science is horrendous. It's most often the case, it's observational, epidemiological data. It's most often retrospective questionnaires relying on people telling the truth and actually remembering what they had, right? Which we know is just, it never sticks. I'll give you an example. They had a group of 5 women that were obese, and they said to them, how much do you think you eat a day? Calories. Okay. And they were like, all of them said somewhere between 800 and 1200. Okay. Bear in mind, these are obese people. And so they put them in a controlled environment, filled the fridges with everything that they said they would have, and they monitored them for a couple of weeks. The average intake was between 2,800 and 3,200 calories a day, each person. It's not that these people were lying. It is a fundamental education issue with understanding how much packaged foods carry from energy and all these kind of things. So that's a problem. So I'm not going to get into calories because they're not my number one focus when you get people onto real food, right? It's tricky to massively overconsume if you're eating, meat, fish, eggs, whatever you choose, that kind of thing. So my point is with this, diet is what you can tolerate. Okay, feel good on, function well on. Because anyone that wants it, I produced a video and you shared it with you, which is on the 3 levels of tolerance. Okay, so basically, what no one really talks about is something called oral tolerance. Okay, so oral tolerance, very simply, is your body's ability to tell the difference between the outside world and your body and act accordingly at an immune level, if that makes sense. So, what happens is you have immune cells on your tongue, like I spoke about, you have them on your tonsils, you have them all the way through, small intestine, large intestine, all these kind of things. So, when people have gut issues or they have skin issues or they have allergy issues, it is highly, highly likely they have lost what we call oral tolerance. So their body's ability to tell what is safe and what is not. So what that means in English is that essentially the body not only attacks food particles, but it will attack your body's own tissues as well, very likely, causing, for some people, hives. For other people, chronic skin issues. For other people, it's gut-specific issues, bloating, distension, pain, chronic, Crohn's, colitis, all them kind of things that are also associated to genetics. So the biggest thing for me when I look at diet for people is I'm looking at, does it have any categorized issues that we need to look at, right? Because with autoimmune, there's very specific proteins that, for instance, copy proteins of the body. Okay. So in immunology, we would call this molecular mimicry. Okay. So it's, let's say, and this is it, we can use this for food or different things, because there's lots of things in the environment that do this in a person who's susceptible. So let's say, for instance, in someone who's celiac, right? Because these are people who are allergic to gliadin in gluten, for instance, and it impacts the transglutamase 2 receptor in the gut. So they can have these huge inflammatory responses. So what can happen is when you see a protein sequence, and say this protein strand is 20 letters long, right? And then you have the tissue underneath it. So you've got gluten here, gliadin, and then you've got the tissue of the body here. If you get 5 of these within that sequence that match, in a dysregulated system, your body won't be able to tell the difference. It will attack both. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So this can happen for people in the brain, specifically with celiac. Because what most people don't know is 6 out of 10 celiacs have no gut symptoms. But 9 out of 10 celiacs all have neurological symptoms.
Interesting.
The only reason celiac is a gut disease is because a gastroenterologist found it. It will be recategorized, I'm sure, as a neurological disease. Because you have these transglutamase receptors all over the body, specifically on the brain. So the thing is with it, to take it away from celiac, people are like, well, I'm not celiac, I just got bloating or whatever it might be. If you lost oral tolerance and you have these immature immune cells in the gut called dendrites, okay? And these dendrites sit below. So in your gut, you have like these finger-like projections that most people have heard of, right? And so even if you have no leaky gut, right? Totally no leaky gut, because a leaky gut model is BS for how it's taught nowadays. So basically, no leaky gut, right? You can have someone who's lost oral tolerance, and these dendrites, instead of sitting below these finger-like projections, they start reaching up because of hypersensitivity of the immune system. And they start interacting with food proteins they should get in nowhere near before they're fully broke down. This will start causing symptoms.
Interesting.
And so therefore, what people will have is they're like, oh, I can eat this food every now and then, but I can't that time. Right? Or when I took these foods out, everything else felt a bit better. Right? So that's a conversation that needs to be had. Oral tolerance, no one talks about, really important. And the best diet I know to help that with people before we even get into allergens is just a rotational diet. Okay. And what I mean by that is, let's say, whatever your dietary concern is, you have, a form of meat or fish, some vegetables, some fruit on Monday, right? And you don't eat them foods again till Thursday. And then Tuesday would be different meat, fish, foods, whatever your dietary choices are. And then Wednesday would be different. And then you just rotate. So you're basically not eating the same foods every 4 days. And honestly, when I've seen people do that, even in the absence of taking away all the allergens and everything, I've seen massive remission in their gut issues. We can get into obviously then looking at stomach acid levels and enzyme activity and all those kind of things, because that's what I have to look at with ulcerative colitis. But the reality is, one of the biggest problems in someone who's sensitized with food dietary issues, especially if you have symptoms, is that you're in a position where you're exposed to the same stuff every day all the time. And if the immune system starts to get dysregulated, not necessarily because the food's a problem or trying to poison us or whatever it might be, but because these things over here, all the environmental things are putting burden on the system as well, you just have less resilience to deal with all this stuff, right? And then the most common question I get from this is like, well, I took this food out for 30 days, whatever it might be. And then when I put it back in, I had a much worse reaction. That's the body being very clever to tell you it's definitely a problem for you. So basically, when you have acute inflammation in the immune system, you produce IgM cells. Okay, IgM are acute immune cells, normally last 21 to 30 days. Okay, so basically, they don't proliferate autoimmune processes, they don't proliferate breakdown of local tissues, they are just there to signal to the immune system we need to do something, right? So then what happens is, if you then go from there, you produce IgG cells, okay? Just a different immunoglobulin within the immune cell. So what happens is that if you have someone who's sensitized or they have an issue, the first time they get exposed, they produce a certain level of IgG cells, okay? But it's like this. Every time you get exposed, more. And then more on top of that. So basically, things get more severe over time if nothing's done to regulate that immune response. So literally, that's where you get these compounding issues over time for people. They're like, I took it out, I felt better, but then I put it back in, I had this horrendous reaction. And I'm like, that's probably the thing you need to test to see whether you can ever eat it again. Because there will be certain people that have certain immune pathways that it would be recommended that that isn't something they can consume.
Yeah.
It's not everybody, but it's definitely some.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, for me at the moment, it's coffee. I love coffee like yourself, and yeah, every time I drink it, it gives me stomach pain, and it's I'll go periods where I'll leave it just to see, and then I'll have one.
Yeah.
Depending on how, typically it's depending on how my nervous system is. If it's if I'm more stressed and sensitized, it's typically going to be more of an issue. But
what I would say with coffee is that what you will find with coffee is that there's a few mechanisms. One is the caffeine, right? That could, on an empty stomach or an irritated gut, that could really be an issue for someone, right? So, I shouldn't tell people this, but let's say you took 200 milligrams of L-theanine when drinking that coffee. If you notice a radical difference with how you feel, is probably more nervous system related, if that makes sense. Okay. The other thing to consider with coffee is that you have a gene that processes, which is called CYP1A2. You can fact check me on this, but I think I remember the gene correctly. And that is responsible for the processing of how quickly you metabolize. Okay. So if you get someone who's a slow metabolizer, that's probably not going to make them feel very comfortable when they have caffeine. Right. And then if you have someone that has, like Marta, for instance, a very slow impaired COMT gene, which is responsible for clearing stress-based neurotransmitters, then all of a sudden, or catecholamines, then all of a sudden, slow ability to clear coffee plus slow ability to clear stress-based neurotransmitters, which will come as a side effect of caffeine intake, you can create a nervous system that all of a sudden feels quite charged. Right, that stress feeling, if that makes sense. So, like, there are ways around it, things to do. Like, I give her L-theanine because, she, for instance, will tolerate that coffee much better, and she probably only drinks it twice a week, maybe. Right, she doesn't drink milk or anything like this, so we can work around it for something she really enjoys, and it's not causing her any more. Damage is the wrong word, but it's not causing her any compromise in other areas that we can't see. Does that make sense? As where there are certain people that immunologically might have problems. But the immunological part of coffee is normally from instant coffee. And the reason for that is normally the cross-contamination with gluten in that. The same as, for instance, people getting like celiacs, getting unbeknown exposures when they drink out of paper straws, which the glue is often made out of some form of wheat.
Well, didn't know that. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So like all these little things, because it's below certain parts per million, it doesn't have to be declared, right? But for these super, super, super high sensitive individuals that I might see, right, every now and then, like these are things I have to make them aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's coffee's always an interesting one. There's some people that perform really well on it, and there's others that, yeah, it's always an issue.
Coffee, coffee is probably the best legal stimulant from a performance point of view, but it's really a timing thing. The biggest issue I see with coffee is timing. Like if you're drinking coffee after 12, it's probably reliance, not performance. Right? Yeah. The thing is with coffee, the caffeine is in your system. 50% of it, so the half-life of coffee is between 7 and 9 hours, people will argue. Right? So you drink a coffee, this is how it messes up sleep, right? So you drink a coffee at say 2 or 3 p.m. Right? 50% of that caffeine is still in your blood, let's say at 7 if we're being conservative. When do you start producing melatonin, which is your sleep hormone, before you go to sleep? 3 to 5 hours before bed it starts to rise. Coffee obviously increases stress-based neurotransmitters, which are direct competitors to melatonin. So with anybody, I just like keep it before 12 if you can tolerate. And generally, you won't get too many negative effects. You'll get certain people, though, that even if they drink one coffee at 8 a.m. after breakfast, they still better sleep without it if their nervous system is really dysregulated.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Cliff, I wanted to, there's one final area that I wanted to discuss with you, which probably, if we'd have done this podcast 2 years ago, I probably wouldn't be able to put up. But as we are now in 2025, I want to ask you a question related to COVID, because we've had myself personally, I think I've had some issues after contracting COVID, but I never took a vaccine. Mm-hmm. Then you also have people that took the vaccine, but it's coming out that they are also having issues as well, potentially more significantly than those that didn't, based on some of the conversations that we've had as well. I don't know how much you can share from obviously working with clients, but what are you seeing the long-term impact of that period of COVID-19 and how that's impacting people's health, over the last few years and still now in 2025?
Yeah. In some ways, I'm fortunate and unfortunate that I knew about this really early. So one of my mentors is a world-leading immunologist. So in March 2020, he was able to get samples of COVID from China as early infections. And he is a specialist in autoimmune, environmental reactivity in the world, how that affects the immune system, all this kind of stuff. So he published a review article in June showing when you expose the natural spike protein, the full spike protein, COVID to 24 different tissues in the body as antibodies, he showed the correlation to the cross-reactivity, the thing we spoke about earlier, with regards to how it would affect them tissues negatively, for instance. Anything was as low as 10% up to 80-odd%, which was like thyroid, for instance. He published this in June, and nothing. Just absolutely nothing. No one cared, right? Obviously. But from then, I've been extremely concerned about the uptick in autoimmunity. And we're seeing this last year, 13%, year before that, 13% increases above baselines, which is crazy. But what people have to understand is that to get a diagnosable autoimmune disease, it probably takes you on average, I think the last date was like 10 years and 15 doctors. So this is diagnosable stage 3 disease. There are 2 stages before that I look for, because you don't want them to get to that. Like when you get to a stage 3 disease, you've probably got 70% local tissue damage. They can find it on a biopsy. They can see it on imaging, for instance. Like it's a long way down the path, right? The first thing I'm looking for is just the presence of antibodies and symptoms, right? So when I mean that is that their life is compromised in some way, shape or form, whether it's energy, gut issues, whatever it might be. And then if we see autoimmune antibodies to that tissue of the body, okay, now we know there's problems, right? So we know COVID was a potent trigger for autoimmune, for sure, and that's been proven. Lots of studies that came out since then. I've dealt with people that had long COVID from natural infection. I've dealt with people that had, whether you call them injuries or adverse reactions to mRNA. I've worked with doctors on these physical things. Like I had doctors who work within the NHS that had no previous skin issues, for instance. And then 3-4 days after their second injection, just broke out in rashes and stuff all over their body, including their face, everything. And so we have to talk about the interaction with different parts of the immune system and how different things happen. The reality is that I work on a very person-to-person level, so I'm very reserved to say like what it means on a bigger scale, if that makes sense. But in my own personal practice, I've seen people devastated. I've seen them lose neurological function. I've seen people stuck in bed. I've seen people, and this is natural infection. I know one guy who couldn't walk up the stairs without getting out of breath, for instance, post natural infection. But what I would say is that a lot of these people had things going on that they didn't really know about before or didn't take serious enough. And they were sitting in the background, a bit like we spoke about quite early on about how, atherosclerotic disease, heart disease takes decades to build up. Like this is kind of what was happening for these people. Or you had people that had family history of things like autoimmune and things along these lines that hadn't been triggered yet, but COVID was the potent trigger for that process to start. Like that's what I've seen consistently.
So it's almost like on some level, you've taken people that have got an autoimmune or their immune system is compromised already, and COVID's really just kicked it over the edge. And
it was definitely a potent trigger for people, for sure. And that's the immune side. The other side to it, though, is the biggest thing that we're seeing at the moment is people getting recurrent illness all the time, every 6 to 8 weeks throughout the year, summer as much as winter. That was an interesting discussion because there was a paper that came out not so long back discussing why that's happening. So basically, they found a clear set of data points in quite a big study. I can't remember exactly how many thousands it was, but it's not a 15 people study, if that makes sense. They found a real strong correlation between basically the more vaccines that someone had, mRNA vaccines, the more illness that they got. And there's a very specific immunological reaction for that. So basically, what was happening when they were giving the vaccines, they were training it for a very specific part of the spike protein. Okay. But when you do that, you end up producing what we call a lot of IgG4 cells. Okay. Which is then essentially turning the immune system down to anything else. So then its ability at a cell level, because you have 2 sides of the immune system. You have like this acute immune system, which is like your cell-mediated immune system. So when something gets exposed to you, it's non-specific, but it reacts very quickly, right? And then you have this adaptive immune system, which is that immune system which has a memory, right? So basically what happens is we ended up suppressing this cell-mediated immune system and keep pushing this adaptive. So therefore, no one could acutely create a non-specific response to protect themselves. And obviously viruses, when they get in the cell, for instance, they'll replicate over time, right? And then if you don't have enough cell-specific, virus-specific cells, you're going to have issues, okay? So that's a big part of it. The other thing that's a big part of it is that COVID caused a lot of reactivation of other latent viruses. So HHV6 is one that I see a lot, and also Epstein-Barr virus, because these are things that just sit in your cells, and if your immune system is good and everything's going okay, then essentially it will keep them at bay. But as soon as the immune system starts to get some suppression, high stress, lack of sleep, too much alcohol, or infection, these latent viruses can become prevalent again throughout the system. And the data is very clear on the negative disease states of Epstein-Barr uncontrolled or HHV6 uncontrolled, like not good. So yeah, these are kind of the patterns I'm seeing.
Okay, interesting. Cool, Cliff. Well, look, I want to quickly wrap things up with, I'd like to do a couple of questions at the end, very straightforward. First off, for you personally, favorite coffee brand, your favorite coffee brand, because I know you're a big coffee lover.
Jesus.
What are you liking at the moment?
At the moment, I am drinking two coffees. I'm going to say two. So one is DAC Coffee Roasters from Amsterdam.
Okay.
I'm drinking their washed geisha from Nestlé, which will mean nothing to 99% of people, but if you know anything about coffee, it's amazing. And then the other one is Café Circulaire, which is a Swedish brand. Essentially, they pretty much consistently produce the coffees that are used by most world champions for brewing cups and all this kind of stuff. So I have a Panama from them, and then I have a Colombian from DAC.
Interesting. Real coffee connoisseur.
I'm a geek for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, definitely sounds like you know your stuff. And what would you say, what's your favorite coffee shop in the world? Not necessarily the best coffee, but the experience. What would you say? Because you've been to a number. I always see you on Facebook in different coffee shops.
Yeah, so basically in London, we just found a new one. So we went to a place called Calico, and they just opened like a month ago. It is Chinese owned, just outside of Waterloo Station. And it is possibly some of the best brewed coffees I've ever experienced. Because most of them, in most coffee shops, they either use the wrong water, the wrong parts per million, the wrong brew technique, the wrong grind size. These guys are consistently perfect, which I've just never seen. And then in the world, DAC Coffee Roasters open their own showroom. So it's in Amsterdam. It's not their own shop, but it's like a shop and taste. So like if you want to buy something, they'll brew you the espresso or they'll brew you the pour over to see if you like it. And because it's all their own coffees, they have dialed them in to the point that you just like, how do I get to taste like this at home? Does that make sense? Like they have different water system for their espresso compared to the water system for their pour overs. They use, different grind sizes for all different things. It's perfection of standard, like unbelievable standard. So in the world, probably them, to be honest.
Interesting. Yeah. You'll have to check it out, guys, if you're listening in and you're in Amsterdam.
If you're in Amsterdam, DAC, Fried Hats, the Fuku Caf, as it's called. Them guys are two gold standard people.
Good stuff. Cool. Well, Cliff, where can people find you? I know that you're pretty active in putting out content on Facebook. If people want to reach out and potentially work with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, just drop me a DM on Facebook or something, or you can just cliffandmartyr.com. Super simple.
Brilliant. All right, guys. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Charles Travers Show. Until next time, over and out.